people I met with over the next few days that some part of Psalm 103 applied so specifically to their life. And now I realize, I can look back and realize God was in that. He spoke, I listened, and God used this dialogue to advance some aspect of his kingdom work. We must train our hearts to listen to God. We must train our hearts to listen to God. And because we're fallen creatures, we get it wrong sometimes. But we want to choose to seek God's voice rather than hide from it. So we want to ask the question, what is God saying to me through his word? What is God saying to me through my circumstances? What is God saying to me through this person? And listening to God is harder today than ever because we live in a world with so much influence, right? Our phones are constantly communicating to us, and we're looking to them to fill our minds. But it's crucial that we spend significant time pausing to pay attention to what God is saying and doing. If you get out in God's creation some this summer, without your phone, take a walk, or take a break from listening to music when you're on the bus or in your car or wherever, and just sit in silence. Or find a quiet place to read God's word and respond in prayer. Say, speak, God, I'm listening. Prayer is a two-way dialogue. And this brings us to a second truth this passage teaches us about prayer, that prayer deepens our trust in God. Prayer deepens our trust in God. Now, remember, part of why God chose to reveal his purposes to Abraham here was so that Abraham might teach his descendants to live rightly and justly. And I would suggest that more than anything else that's accomplished in this prayer, through this dialogue with God, Abraham deepens in his trust in God as a God who's both righteous and just. Okay, so at this point, God has spoken, and now it's Abraham's turn. Let's pay close attention to what he says. Verses 22 to 25. And so the men turned from there and went towards Sodom, but Abraham still stood before the Lord. Then Abraham drew near and said, will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? Suppose there are 50 righteous in the city. Will you then sweep away the place and not spare it for the 50 righteous who are in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to put the righteous to death with the wicked, so that the righteous spares the wicked. Far be that from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just? So as Abraham heard that God would judge Sodom and Gomorrah, something wasn't quite sitting well within Abraham's heart. Now, Abraham could just say, God is God. God will do whatever he wills. Who am I to call that into question? But that's not what Abraham does. As it says, as the two of the men left, Abraham stood before the Lord. And that says he drew near to God. I love that. And he asked God this question that was troubling his heart. And you get a sense in this passage that there's this element of fear and troubling in Abraham here. He's thinking, how is God going to respond to this? And yet this doesn't stop Abraham from drawing near to God to ask his troubling question. And what is his question about? It's a question about God's character. He asks God, are you going to sweep away the righteous with the wicked? If there are 50 righteous people in the city, will you just wipe them out too, God? Far be it from you, God, to put to death the righteous with the wicked. God, you're the judge of all the earth. Shouldn't you do what's just? These are bold words that Abraham is speaking to God. There's something in Abraham that's questioning God's character. And he believes that God is merciful and just, or else he wouldn't say what he says. But God's actions here don't seem just to him. Now, why might Abraham be thinking this? Well, Abraham has a history with Sodom and Gomorrah. They're not just these random cities. For starters, Abraham's nephew and Lot and his family lived there. And so Abraham's probably thinking about them. He doesn't want to see them perish, God's judgment. Genesis 14 also tells of a time when Sodom and Gomorrah was attacked by enemies, and some of its people were taken captive, including Lot. And Abraham actually went down there with some of his men, fought the enemy, rescued Lot, his family, and a bunch of other people from there. And Abraham even had a friendly interaction with the king of Sodom. And so Abraham, he knows a bunch of people in that city. And he was probably thinking, like, these are good people. Sure, there are probably some wicked people in that land, but there's got to be a solid 50 righteous people there. And so it wouldn't be right for God to wipe them out too. Something about this just seems unjust to Abraham. What's remarkable about what Abraham does is he's not willing to just leave it be, whether by quickly concluding, God must be just, even if I don't understand it. Or even worse, Abraham could quickly conclude that God is unjust, and I don't want to have anything to do with this God. But Abraham doesn't do either of those things. Instead, he takes a risk by drawing near to God with trembling and boldness. And God gives him an answer. In verse 26, then the Lord said, if I find that Sodom 50 righteous in the city, I will spare the whole place for their sake. Okay, Abraham thinks, I got through that one. If there's 50 righteous there, God won't wipe out that place. But still, Abraham's heart isn't quite settled. Verses 27 to 28, Abraham answered and said, behold, I have undertaken to speak to the Lord. I who am but dust and ashes. Suppose 5 of the 50 righteous are left. Will you destroy the whole city for a lack of 5? And he said, I will not destroy it if I find 45 there. Abraham clearly wasn't content with the number 50, and so he goes to God again, humbly. He says, God doesn't have to speak to me, that I'm not God, I'm only a man, I'm just dust and ashes. But he asks if God would consider sparing the city for 45 righteous people there. And God says, I won't destroy it for 45 righteous there. And then as we read in the passage earlier, I don't need to go through it all again. There's this back and forth that continues. Each time Abraham lowers the number until God says he won't destroy the city even if 10 righteous people are there. And then that's where the conversation ends. Now, at first glance, this back and forth between Abraham and God seems kind of strange. Like as though Abraham is negotiating with God, like akin to haggling for some item at the Medina or something. But then when you stop and think about it, there's nothing that actually changes about God's judgment through this dialogue. In the next chapter, we learn God ended up bringing judgment on Sodom and Gomorrah and destroying those cities. So all along, God knew that there weren't even 10 righteous people in those cities. And we won't go into all the specifics, but the following chapters and elsewhere tell a lot of grotesque details of all the horrible wickedness that was taking place in those cities. Even Lot and his family looked pretty bad, although later on, 2 Peter does refer to Lot as righteous. But if he was the best one there, it's not really saying much. And so if this dialogue between Abraham and God wasn't to change God's standard for his justice, then what's the point of this dialogue? But the point isn't about God lowering the number because Abraham had convinced God to change his mind. The main point of this prayer is that through the process of this exchange, it allows Abraham to conclude that God is indeed just. Now, we're not sure why Abraham stopped at the number 10, but 10 must have been low enough for him to trust that God won't wipe out large numbers of righteous people with the wicked. And Abraham was likely surprised when God brought judgment upon Sodom and Gomorrah. He probably thought that there were more than 10 righteous people there. However, after the judgment, Abraham could look back on this dialogue and see that God's judgment was just. God didn't wipe out droves of righteous people with the wicked. Now, God was under no obligation to share his intentions with Abraham, much less defend himself against Abraham's doubts, but God chose to do all this. Why? Because God wanted Abraham to deepen in his trust in him. And ultimately, so Abraham could be a part of God's work in the world. And this is such a major part of what prayer accomplishes. Yes, prayer can change things in the world. We'll see many examples of that in future weeks. But prayer also changes us. Prayer changes us. Prayer changes the person praying. If we're honest, we have so many questions about God and why God chooses to do what he does. Not even suggest that the person who has never questioned God probably has a fairly shallow relationship with God. But the amazing thing is God doesn't want us to hide our questions or our doubts. God actually wants us to bring them to him. God wants us to bring him our questions and our doubts. And so we can boldly go to God and say, God, I don't understand this. God, why is this happening? And you may not have an exchange like Abraham has with God here, but God is kind when we go to him with real prayers, helping us to understand more about him, ultimately so we can deepen our trust in him and be used for his purposes. Sometimes we do need to just step back and say, God is God, even if I don't understand certain aspects about him. But there's really no need to do that until you've wrestled with God with what's really on your heart. So go to him boldly with your questions and listen. And if it still doesn't make sense, go to him again and again. And that whole process can deepen trust in God. I don't know about you, but I love the testimonies last week. So encouraging, like awesome to hear ways God moves, answers prayers. But just as impactful were those testimonies where people said, it's been a hard season, but I've really learned to trust God in it. Or I've been praying the same prayer for 20 years and I haven't gotten the answer I'm hoping for, so I'm still praying. And we can't often know why God works as he does, but we can know this. This process of prayer is certainly a means of growing our trust in God. Prayer deepens our trust in God. This brings us to the third and final truth we learn about prayer in this passage. That we're just kind of briefly touch on it now because it'll be a major theme in future weeks. That prayer enables us to partner with God. Prayer enables us to partner with God. And not in the sense of like equal partners or something, but prayer allows us to join God in what he's already doing in the world. For Abraham, we've already seen how this prayer, it didn't actually change what God was ultimately going to do for Sodom and Gomorrah. Rather, the prayer changed Abraham. But how is that Abraham partnering with God for his global purposes? Well, because Abraham grew in his trust of God here, later on, when God asked Abraham to do something hard, Abraham could trust him. Years later, famously, God tested Abraham by calling him to sacrifice his son Isaac, which, again, we know that wasn't really what God had intended. But if anything would have seemed unrighteous to Abraham, like it would be that request, right? But Abraham trusted God, and he passed the test. And then the narrative ends in Genesis 22:15-18, saying, "And the angel of the Lord called to Abraham the second time from heaven and said, By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. Your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies, and in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice." So in the end, this prayer in Genesis 18 was part of Abraham learning to trust God, and through that trust, he came to obey God, and this led to God fulfilling his promises to bless the nations, which is ultimately realized in Jesus Christ, who came and died and rose so that any who believe in him will be eternally blessed. And if you're a Christian, you've benefited from this prayer that Abraham prayed 4,000 years ago. And surely Abraham thought his prayer would accomplish something different, to spare some people in Sodom and Gomorrah from judgment. But while it didn't do that, in the grand plan of God, it was part of God's purpose to spare millions, if not billions, from judgment through the work of Christ. Because we're declared righteous through faith, and God doesn't judge the righteous with the wicked. Sometimes we can see God answer our prayers in the way we hope, and sometimes we can't. But ultimately, we can trust that God will weave all of our prayers together to advance his kingdom purposes. God will weave all of our prayers together to advance his kingdom purposes in the world. Because prayer enables us to partner with God. We're going to take communion right now. In a few moments, I'll ask you to come up, make a line, got a little more space up here. right now. Change the setup. How it works, you're going to come up, receive the elements, return to your seats, and then I'll lead us in taking them together. Those downstairs in the mega room, invite you to come up as well, join the line. The table is open to all who trusted in Jesus. And as you come, okay, make this a time of real communion with God. A time of listening. A time of asking God your questions. And trusting that God is using your prayers for his purposes. But remember this. Jesus' body broken and his blood shed is what even enables you to have a relationship with God. And so come confessing the ways that you've hid from God in your sin, but also confessing Christ's righteousness for you. Come boldly to the throne of grace and find mercy rather than judgment. God, we come before you right now as your people who just heard you speak to us. And God, we come to you right now to commune with you. God, we believe that you hear our prayers.